average compared to more developed countries. And at the same time, we all need to converge on the very important role played by international credit institutions such as CAF, that has played a very important role during the crisis and will continue to do so in future years, choosing relevant projects for the region and facilitating credit and the necessary collaterals and guarantees. As will be discussed in this discussion, this new context requires essential efforts to put together the new agenda and that places the digital agenda as a main aspect. And in this context, it's very important to reinforce the relationships between the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean. The COVID-19 crisis offers undoubtedly a great opportunity to reactivate this relationship as it's morally and strategically required. And we need to reformulate the parameters that the interconnection was created upon, because it's underserving its potential compared to other regions. And indeed, in pursuing this effort, I think it's important to highlight the role of Spain to reinforce this relationship. Our country is undertaking very important efforts to enhance political dialogue and high-level relationships on both sides of the Atlantic, so that we can put in place action programs at both sides of the Atlantic, as I said, to reinforce the trade relationships between the European Union and Latin America. And in this sense, it's very important that we move forward in the signature of the Mercosur agreement and the renewed Mexico agreement. And it will be very important and necessary to include Latin America in the perspective of Central European Union policies, the Green Agenda, connectivity. And finally, it's also very important to undertake efforts so that we can make it easier for Latin America to access international investment. We need to have joint action in this direction so that Latin America can become a top priority for them. And without further ado, I would like to welcome you to this premises and wish you a fruitful conference. Thank you very much, Arturo Pérez Fernández, Director General of Casa America. And undoubtedly, that's one of the topics that will be tackled today, that and the unprecedented crisis that, like any other crisis, can come with opportunities. In this case, also, it brings about the need to do joint work between Latin America and Europe. And new options and new opportunities are opening up, and we are going to reflect upon it during this session. We'll talk about the need to invest in physical and digital infrastructures, but before we do that, we are going to hear the words of the Executive President of CAF, Mr. Rodríguez Urarte, Secretary of State, Ana de la Cueva, distinguished panelists, friends all. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this annual CAF conference, and on this occasion we are going to focus on the recovery that needs to take place in our region and the strategic alliances that need to be forged with the European Union. CAF's experience in its work with Spain, that has an 18-year-old history, as it's been part of the corporation for very long, and our relationship has been very fruitful, not just because of the work we've done in terms of public and private infrastructures, but also because of the knowledge and support that we have been able to channel in the region using different instruments that go from innovation, water support, dam support, strategic agricultural plans, and also now the challenge of supporting SMEs and the industry network that's necessary in Spain to really create a regional value chain. And for this reason, we think it's essential to foster the relationship between Latin America and Europe, and its core will be infrastructures for integration and digital infrastructures. We consider consider that there are instruments and tools that we can put to use so that we can channel these resources and push forward a program with 500 projects on integration and on digital aspects that can make a difference and can be the differential point between suffering the pandemic or reboosting growth in the region. And thank you very much for being here, for having joined us in this virtual session of our annual conference, and I really hope that we have a very fruitful discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much, President Carranza. Well, we can see now the importance of reinforcing that relationship between Europe and Latin America revolving around infrastructures. Infrastructures are going to be the pillar. How will we do it? What will be the tools? This is something that we will discuss during the event. But if you allow me, we are now going to have some opening remarks so that we can start with our first panel. In this sense, I'm going to give the floor to Ana de la Cueva, Secretary of State for Economy and Corporate Support for Spain, who is going to deliver the opening remarks on the first conference, virtual conference, CAF 2020, that is called An Alliance for Economic Recovery. Thank you very much, dear President of CAF, President of Casa America, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, and thank you, CAF, for having me in this great opportunity to reflect on the situation of the relationships between Europe and Latin America and to tackle opportunities and future challenges. Undoubtedly, the COVID crisis has been a turning point, an unprecedented turning point, and the virulence of the disease, the simultaneous impact that it's had in different countries and areas, the lack of knowledge that we had in the beginning, and the reaction that medical centers have had to undergo has led the government to implement isolation measures that are very exceptional because of their reach and their duration. And this has had an unprecedented impact on the world economy. The GDP, the world GDP is reaching historical highs, and in the case of Latin America, the achievements that we've had in the social and economic sphere in the last decade have been reverted, and millions of people have fallen into poverty. Actually, economic forecasts say that per capita income could decrease sharply in Latin America. And in this sense, the European Union is responding in an agile and sound manner and tackling different forefronts that have helped countries to put in place measures, very important measures from the economic standpoint and social standpoint. And in the case of Spain, we have risen up to the challenge, and we've set up measures to protect the productive fabric, to protect families and keep employment. And we are designing a long-term plan to uphold our economy. And we've also put forward an unprecedented effort in line with what's been done by surrounding countries. We have public resources at the disposal of our citizens. We have a 5% budget support, 15% of GDP in terms of liquidity. In the Latin America region, the situation is more complicated because countries don't have fiscal leeway, and their access to market is more limited, and they have restricted options to put in place mechanisms to support their companies and their citizens. Therefore, the crisis is even deeper. This is why this session is an opportunity to reflect upon how both regions have contribute to helping us get out of the crisis as soon as possible, but not at any price, but ensuring sustainable and inclusive growth. And it's important to reflect upon the importance of infrastructure, especially the digital infrastructures, because they're part of the strategy. And in this sense, it's important to underline the capacity of infrastructures as the core element because it's essential for further integration and inclusion. And undoubtedly, no one can challenge the importance of digitalization as an essential tool for socioeconomic development. It's something that needs to be cross-cutting and encompass all productive environments. Especially relevant is education, vocational training, professional training, and the productive model. And in this context, it's very essential that we have multilateral cooperation so that we can serve the urgent needs for the health and social aspects and guarantee the mid and long-term growth. Spain is clearly a European and multilateral multilateral, and as a consequence, we take active participation in global governance through different institutions that it's part of, and also through European Union institutions. Spain's commitment with multilateralism is something undoubtable. We have been a part of the institutions that have been put at our disposals, and we have participated in the different capital increases that have happened throughout time, even during the pandemic. Our multilateral vocation has always been made compatible with our interest in privileging the special relationship that unites us with Latin America. Spain is the only European country that's part of the four large multilateral development banks in the region. We participate with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, and together with Portugal, we are members of CAF, the Development Bank for Latin America, and the Central American Bank for Cooperation. Before the pandemic, multinational entities were essential to reach our development goals for 2030, and thus putting forward the need to mitigate climate change, health, education, food safety, inclusion, or gender equality, amongst others. And the pandemic has caused positive results or positive steps to be reverted or stop. And it is the right time to reinforce multilateralism as a way to leave the crisis behind, as has been stated in the different multilateral meetings that Spain has participated in, as for instance the G20 summit that Spain participated in June. And we have unprecedented economic resources to help countries get out of or deal with the consequences of COVID. There have been many agreements to delay the service of external debt for middle-income countries, and this is a very important landmark in the sphere of multilateral cooperation. And this has allowed countries to free up resources so that they could be devoted to fighting the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic within its borders. But the current crisis is so complex that it's necessary to combine public and private efforts. The economic authorities of countries are receiving very high amounts of resources, and sometimes their absorption and management capabilities can be put at stakes. And it's very important that we coordinate, that we have in place coordination in multilateral organizations, and that we collaborate with the private sector in all these economies, with the goal that having countries assume the responsibilities of their own development because they have a certain level of income. But multilateral banks normally concentrate their financing in those countries that have lower incomes, and Spain can be a liaison between these countries and the rest of Latin America and Latin American economies, as long as they have common possessions. With this idea in mind, the President of the Government of Spain called for the summit Together for Recovery, Response for Latin America and the Caribbean in the face of COVID, where our governments and many others asked institutional economic institutions to gather resources irrespective of the income needs of the different countries. And in 2019, the European Union manifested the need to have more efficient bilateral and coordination. And Latin America and the Caribbean are uniting forces for a future, for a common future, and they want to modernize itself with an ambitious vocation in line with the spirit of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And Spain supports this bi-regional approach, and it can serve as bridge in the financial, social spheres, and the bond between our governments is complemented with the presence of Spanish companies. And I would like to close my intervention by saying that even though the Latin American region is still facing very important challenges, such as the consolidation of middle class, the very high inequality, or the fight against corruption, it's still a region that has great potential. Advances that have been registered in the last few decades are spectacular. Democracy has consolidated across almost all countries. The per capita income has twofolded. The Human Development Index has increased. Poverty has reduced, as well as inequality. And as responsibility as public servants is to do what's necessary so that these achievements won't be reverted, because we are in front of a global crisis that requires a global response. And therefore, now it's a time for multilateral relationships, and Spain is fully committed with this process. You can count on us. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Secretary. Now we are very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Uta Urpilainen, who is the European Commissioner for International Associations. Uta Urpilainen started her career in the Finnish Parliament, being elected in 2003, and in 2008 she became the first woman to lead the Social Democratic Party in Finland. Then she was appointed Minister of Finance and Vice First Minister of Finland between 2011 and 2014. In her current position, she leads European cooperation, building alliances for the development of other regions.
The COVID-19 pandemic has been like an X-ray and revealed what is strong and what is weak in our societies. This is a health crisis, but it is also a serious and concerning social and economic crisis. With poverty and inequality getting worse, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is in serious danger. The pandemic is hitting Latin America and the Caribbean hard. Together, we have a lot of work to do to build back better and become more resilient. We know what needs to be done. Now we need to do it. We must strengthen health and education systems and create the conditions for more and better jobs. We must champion gender equality in all we do. The European Union and its member states, together with European financial institutions, are Team Europe. As part of our global response to COVID-19, we have redeployed close to 1 billion euros for Latin America and the Caribbean. We want this commitment to translate into alliances with partners. CAF is a strategic partner. With CAF, we need to build green alliances. Together, we can form digital alliances using European knowledge on governance and standards alongside urgent investments. We need to foster an alliance for sustainable growth and trade with better jobs and opportunities for small businesses. Dear colleagues, together we can make these alliances work. We have the tools, and these don't include only official development assistance. We promote investments. We can push common agendas. With triangular cooperation, we address regional priorities quickly and effectively. With CAF, the EU already supports different projects ranging from road infrastructure to sustainable cities. I hope to take the partnership with CAF to a new level soon. Ladies and gentlemen, with our shared vision, together we can design the future we want for our children. Let us work together to rebuild more inclusive and sustainable societies in a post-COVID world. I am sure that your discussions today will take us one step closer to making it a reality. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos las palabras.
We would like to thank Jutta Urpilainen, European Commissioner for International Associations. I would like to remind you that you can share your opinions on social media with the hashtag EuropaCAF and follow our account AgendaCAF on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are now going to start with our first panel in this event, which is entitled Towards Economic Recovery After the Pandemic, a bi-regional vision. And in order to do that, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Alicia González, correspondent for international economy of El País. Hello, welcome everybody, and good afternoon in Madrid. Good morning to those who are at the other side of the Atlantic. We're here today to tackle a very important matter. Some of the previous statements have already tackled the aspect of the difficulties that the region is going through. In the last few weeks, we haven't heard very good news. The International Monetary Fund foresaw that the world economy would fall by 8.1. Then the CEFAL, the Economic Commission of the United Nations for Latin America, said that the drop was going to be 9.1%. Recently, the Bank of Spain was a bit more optimistic, but nonetheless, they considered that the economy would decrease by 8%. Approximately. At any rate, whatever the final figures are, this would be the worst recession in more than 1 century. And this is going to mean that many of the advancements that have been achieved in the last decades, as was stated by the Secretary of State, will disappear, will blur, and we will see indeed an increase in poverty after the great reduction that we've of that poverty gap that we've witnessed in the last few decades. There's going to be an increase in inequality in a region that has the disadvantage of being one of the most unequal regions in the world. And the per capita GDP, as said by the IMF, is going to go back 1 decade. These are not good news. This is not good for global economy either. It's not something exclusive of this region, but something that we can share is how to face the situation and the post-pandemic world. And in order to do that, we have with us this afternoon some of the best analysts to discuss in what direction and the region could move and what we can do now. We have with us Rebecca Trintan, Secretary General for America. Welcome. We also have Azucena Arbeleche, Minister of Economy and Finances of Uruguay. How are you? Mauricio Pozo, Minister of Economy and Finances for Ecuador, recently appointed, by the way. Welcome. And Emma Navarro, Vice President of the European Investment Bank. How are you? I would like us to start with Ms. Greenspan. With the scenario that has been described by international financial institutions, what is it to expect? What is there to expect from the region? Dear Alicia, thank you very much. I would like to greet especially the ministers, the Vice President of the European Investment Bank. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today. I think what you said, Alicia, perfectly mirrors reality. And what we've said is that structural conditions in our region pre-COVID have interacted with the pandemics and therefore have the potential of widening the inequality and poverty gaps in the region. And of course, people who had previous health conditions, they suffer COVID more sharply than others. Well, that's the same for countries. We are all going to be impacted by the pandemics, and of course the way we will leave this pandemic behind will be unequal. Not all countries have the same conditions and the same capabilities to leave behind the socioeconomic crisis that the pandemic has made us plunge into. And indeed, Latin America won't be able to get out of this crisis on its own. It needs help, it needs international support, it needs international financial bodies to act promptly and soundly, as they did in 2008 when the G20 and the International Monetary Fund and multilateral banks were capitalized, and then there were special rights issued by the IMF, and indeed the G20 acted very soundly during the 2008 crisis. And this is our demand right now. This is what we need the IMF to do. We need development banks to be recapitalized in the region. The PIV, CAV, the Central American Investment Bank. We need for the G20 to make a statement, to make a claim, and in countries where developed countries have special rights that they are not using, we hope that this could be transferred to other developing countries that are in a weaker position to tackle the pandemics. Let me set an example. The International Monetary Fund, precisely in the forecasts that Alicia mentioned, said that Latin America is going to suffer the greatest impact on this pandemic. Nonetheless, for this year, they are forecasting a decrease of 8.1% for the Latin American region. But for Europe, this decrease is 8.3%. Why, in spite of that, they keep saying that Latin America is going to suffer the greatest impact? Well, because our recovery is going to not be so marked. Actually, Europe is going to recover rapidly because they have the European Investment Bank, and they have the European Union with a fund for recovery that's agreed upon with the European Central Bank. But developing countries need to resort to markets, and actually many countries have done it. Ecuador has been one of the countries that has been able to renegotiate its debt and has the markets. It's still open for it, but some countries will start to see difficulties soon, and it will be very difficult for them to have access to the necessary resources to face the challenges posed by the pandemics. And this is a call for Europe to the year EVA, because EVA, we know that Europe needs to be a relevant partner that should help Latin America get out of this pandemic. This is actually the title of this seminar, and we thought that perhaps we should discuss also the capacity of central banks to extend their capacity to have swaps and repos with some of the region's countries. And we think that Europe can be a very loud voice to support those countries that are wrongly called middle-income countries, because poorer countries have received the attention of G20. Nonetheless, our countries could fit in between those gaps, in between the spaces, and this is a very important moment for us. And I need to say this: the fact that there is financial availability and liquidity forces us to spend well. We have the obligation of spending well and converge towards fiscal and financial sustainability. But without the necessary resources, it will be very difficult for our countries to pull through with the lowest suffering possible, because the forecasts, and I'm going to wrap it up, but the forecasts say that in terms of extreme poverty, at the end of this year, we would be as we were in 1990. 1990. That was 30 years ago. That's 30-year regression. And in terms of moderate poverty, we would have a 15-year regression. And this is a lot of suffering for our citizens. And truth be told, social unrest can increase because of this, and the socioeconomic crisis can become also a political crisis if because we are going to enter a super electoral cycle in 2020 where there will be elections in almost all countries in the region. Very important and interesting points, Secretary. We'll go back to them afterwards, but I would like to highlight the different role that G20 is playing and what we're seeing in different multilateral forums to tackle this crisis vis-a-vis what happened in the financial crisis. We'll go back to this afterwards, but I think it's very interesting to hear the experience of the two ministers in order to spark the discussion. So now I would like to give the floor to Minister Mauricio Pozo so that we can discuss how they are facing the current context in a country with a situation that has also been mentioned by Ms. Greenspan, a country that has limited fiscal capabilities. So how do you feel the situation on site?
Thank you very much for your invitation, Alicia. I would like to salute our colleagues and the other members of the panel. I joined my position a couple of weeks ago, but it's not the first time that I've been a member of a cabinet. I was there years back, and we go back to these functions. The situation in Ecuador is a very peculiar situation that it can help us to understand the situation in which the pandemic and the crisis caught us, and what are the reactions that we've had to it. The Ecuadorian community is a globalized community, a globalized economy. We don't have our own currency. We've been using the dollar as a general currency. We've been doing so for many years, and from that perspective, in these last 2 decades, we've gone through different periods, through different governments where they have emphasized different strategies, but when the problem of the crisis began, when the problem of the pandemic began, the economy in Ecuador already faced an amazing amount of imbalances, and we have been suffering this for more than 1 decade. We already had fiscal problems, deficit between 5 and 6% of our GDP. We had an external sector. We already had a vulnerable external sector, very much dependent on certain exports, oil exports, and others that were not related to oil, with no fiscal savings, with no way of attending the pandemic and this emerging situation that happened, and with an economic activity that was quite stagnated. So much the case was that by the beginning of March, the government announced an economic program to try to improve the fiscal situation, making some decisions with regards to expenses and revenues, fiscal revenues, with the purpose of achieving a close understanding with the credit entities. The announcement was made in that sense, but in a couple of weeks started the pandemic and the lockdowns, the different lockdowns and quarantines, and this in practice meant that the stagnation that we had been suffering on previous year, for this year, it means a drop of the GDP close to 11% according to the IMF. We had never in the past seen a drop in our production in the whole economic history of Ecuador, and this entails different specificities because we've seen high numbers of poverty and unemployment. also because of the situation in the rest of the world and the recession that's taking place because of the crisis is having an impact in some sectors that had an important impact in the revenues of the country, such as the oil. The oil prices fell up to negative values, up to $37 in April last year, in negative terms, and the level of production, together with the problem that we have in an oil pipeline in Ecuador, had an impact on the revenues and in the state budget. And at the same time, the tax collection also fell because with the recession that we were suffering, it was impossible to achieve our revenue goals. At the same time, we also have some fiscal stimulus foreseen in order to correct the problem of the deficit linked to concession policies, because these meant to monetize certain assets, looking for private funds that could help the government to get rid of some assets to reduce the impact that this could have on public expenditure. But this, together with the recession and with all of these elements, we had the need of looking for international support, and that's how the country started negotiations to reach a multilateral agreement. And not so long ago, we reached an agreement with the IMF for $600 billion. The Ecuadorian economy is going to be $96 billion for this year, and this meant a fresh contribution to the state budget that had to come together with other actions. These other actions were seen in the negotiation of the external debt. This external debt that came together with the issuance of bonds for a figure of $16.7 billion at an interest rate of 9.3. This was renegotiated, and that interest rates went down to 5.3%. The average interest rate of these bonds, there was a capital reduction of approximately 1.5 billion and a reduction of the present value of 52%, and 5 years grace period for the capital, in 2 years grace period for the interest, and the obligations when had a tenure until 2030, and then it moved until 2050. So this gave some oxygen to our country. Additionally, the program and the agreement with the IMF in appropriate conditions to our country of free availability in 27 months, also with 4-year grace period, 9.2%, we add some credit line programs fostered by the government for certain specific sectors to make sure that small and medium-sized corporations can face this crisis. And this has been fostered through public and private banking with support mechanisms to give some oxygen to the private activity, with policies to optimize state expenditure in other types of specific actions on vulnerable sectors, such as the food and agricultural sector, that are very sensitive from the social perspective. We defer the payment of taxes as a consequence of the situation, such as value-added taxes. This was deferred for a while, and this, together with the negotiation of some other external obligations, we've begun to renegotiate bilateral debt with other countries. A country with no currency on its own, that cannot use the exchange rate as a defense mechanism in case of an external shock, and with no fiscal support, but with a a huge fiscal deficit and an external fiscal problems, well, it was complicated to recover with no external support, and that's why we had to go to the international markets to find a friendly solution, a market solution to our commercial debt, and at the same time reaching multilateral agreements to receive fresh resources from this source. In our case, this means that the dollars that we are receiving so that the economy can work come from four main routes: exports, all the things that have to do with external financing, and our stocks, our inventory, and external investment or foreign investment. In this case, in a very complicated, is not expanding. The exports, oil exports fell. Non-oil exports, this is paradoxical, but they improved. They improved, and we never thought that this was going to happen. And the other big source for our economy, the stocks fell. And we had to look for financing. This has placed us in a situation where we start seeing signs of recovery in the selling of remittances, or the tax collection has improved in the last months, and we foresee a recovery for next year. We're hoping to have a rebound effect, and probably we might end up having a growth in between 4 and 5% of the GDP. But this goes hand in hand with some of the things that were said at the beginning of this panel. It would have been very complicated, very difficult for us to overcome this situation without international support. The role of international banking is essential in this case. And in the case of Ecuador, this has been the big ingredient so that in this situation we can find ourselves in a route towards recovery. Obviously, we will not be able to reach the financing levels that we have pre-crisis, but we're changing things. I only want to finish by saying the following thing. The actions that I have just mentioned that are related with the good management of public finances came together with two pieces of legislation. One, legislation of majority support in order to facilitate people access to credit lines, and deep down making sure that agreement between the parts will allow for private negotiations between employees and employers, borrowers and borrowees, in such a way that since we cannot depreciate our currency, internal costs can drop and economy can continue on moving. And we are seeing some positive results of these. For example, in terms of employment, which is a variable that suffered a lot as a consequence of the pandemic, where we are already seeing some results. And also we passed a law to put in order public finances, establishing some principles that could be applied during the recovery stage. And that's the information that I wanted to share with all of you. Hopefully these elements can be fruitful in our discussion and in this debate. And if you have any concern or question, I will be more than available to answer it. Thank you very much, dear Minister. It's very interesting because in these first two interventions, you've insisted very much on the role of multilateral relations and the need for collaboration to advance in a situation as complicated as the one that we're living right now with the pandemic. Minister de Leches, in the case of Euro-wide, as mentioned by Secretary Greenspan, we know that the situation is not very equalitarian, and we cannot treat the whole region as a whole. In the case of Uruguay, your social protection system is stronger and more developed. But what's the difference when tackling this crisis also suffered by Uruguay? Yeah, thank you, Alicia, and thank you very much to CAF for giving us the opportunity of participating in this panel and giving us the opportunity of sharing our case and hearing about the other cases in a moment of great uncertainty, as Alicia and Ms. Greenspan said, in which the Latin American region is going to be highly impacted, and in a moment in which uncertainty show the pre-existing problems that our countries were facing and that the whole region was facing. At the same time, we're seeing the arising of new problems that we see with a new sensitivity, and in this case, the Uruguayan case is different. So far, the way we've managed the pandemic showed that we have the situation under control. Crisis is limited or under control. The figures and the international comparison show how our situation is different from the one in the region and in the rest of the world. For every 1,000 diagnoses, we have 8 positive cases, or in a population of 3.5 million, we are right now have more than 300 active cases and 51 fatalities, a situation that we totally regret, and it allows us, I mean, we know that we have to keep our eyes open, but compared to the rest of the world, the performance of Uruguay so far is positive. But of course, we have to continue on being cautious. The strategy of Uruguay is based on different pillars, and in a combination of giving freedom to our citizens with responsibility and obligations to each one of the Uruguayans or people living in our territory. It's been a combination of the support of the scientific community and a clear political leadership that has allowed us to put in place a series of measures, health measures, social measures, and economic measures that are based in the social security system that we have in Uruguay. It's not new. We have a long tradition, of course. When a situation like the one that we're facing right now, sometimes is the moment to realize that there are many deficits in your system and how your system is lagging behind, and this is what we've done. If we see how Uruguay has faced this pandemic, first, the government decided not to impose a mandatory lockdown, a mandatory quarantine. On the contrary, we appeal to the freedom of our citizens with responsibility. This was done very early in time. Still, we took very specific and firm measures that have to do with the closing of the borders. You have to remember that we are in between two very big neighbors, Argentina and Brazil, where the situation of the pandemic is more complicated. So we close our borders with our neighbors. We stop air traffic with some exceptions. The exception were the flights that helped us to repatriate our citizens. Also, we canceled public events, face-to-face schools were closed, and we regulated all the situations that have to do with elderly homes, and we incentivize our population to stay at home and to do remote working. And in this, what has been fundamental is our cooperation with the scientific community. Uruguay has contacted many scientists, experts in the matter, and we have an advisory group that supports the government, more specifically to the President of the Republic, and based on their scientific evidences and the scientific support, the President of the Republic makes his own decisions. In the case of Uruguay, it is also important to highlight the important role of communication. Uncertainties have been huge and are still huge for all of us, also for the government. And from the very first day, the government in March 1st came into office, the new administration, and it was at that time when we find out about the first COVID cases. On that same evening, the president of the government gave a press conference announcing the measures that were going to be put in place, and every 3 days we made a new press conference explaining the new measures, what was known, what was unknown, and everything was put on the table so that the population felt confident, supported, and it has to do with this very strong political leadership of the president of our republic. The president even showed the image of the social, economic, and health aspects in differentiated, and how we were fine-tuning these three different aspects. That obviously the health aspect was the prioritary one, but we understood that the three fields of action, the health, the economic, and the social one, had to be continuously assessed and supported, because the three of them are interconnected and we cannot consider one of the aspects in isolation from the others. We, I mean, at that time, we announced a sentence that was highly felt, but we didn't know what was going to be the impact of that sentence. But we said that the engines of the economy had to continue on running. We couldn't stop the economy. We could run at a slower speed, but we have to continue on moving. So in that sense, we took a series of measures, not only health measures, but measures that have to do with social and economic aspects. In the social aspects, of course, Uruguay has a broad coverage social security system, but in these extraordinary situations, we realized that we have to give it an extra help. So we created a new mechanism of partial performance. So we allowed people to work part-time and receive an unemployment part-time benefit. Also, we supported people over 65 years of age so they could stay at home, together with a subsidy, a sick leave pay, we could say, in order to reinforce this concept of staying at home and teleworking or remote working. Also, as they did in Ecuador, as the minister said, we defer some taxes, we provided direct subsidies to the most vulnerable sectors. We realized that self-employed workers didn't have many supports, even though we were in an extraordinary situation in which the activities had to be stopped. So we provided some mechanisms and support to self-employed or freelance workers. And the sector in which we have worked more is in our support to small and medium-sized companies with credit lines that get the collateral of the state. And here, as Ms. Greenspan said, financial issues are essential. Financial issues are essential, so we need to know where we're going to spend our money, and we need to do some quality expenditure in the more equitative way possible and with the highest possible impact. In this case, we aim at giving loan collateral or securities, giving extra liquidity to the companies. So the problem of liquidity will not be a solvency problem. Also, we mentioned the issue of state resources. Ecuador has already told us about it, but in Uruguay, when managing our debt, we have a policy of pre-financing. We have liquidity or credit lines, contingent credit lines contracted with credit organizations so that we can serve our debts for a few months. This was very important at the moment that the crisis exploded because it allows us to pay our debt with this type of organizations. You have to remember that markets were virtually closed. It was very difficult to get to them, or the interest rates that were given to us were very high, but Uruguay was able to use these pre-financing policies and these pre-contingent policies, and was able to pay at a good interest rates and could issue in the international market and in local currency once the market is strengthened and once the interest rate drop. Said all these things, still the economic impact beyond the economic one, it's been quite strong in Uruguay. We've had a second quarter with a drop of almost 11% of the GDP. However, as the minister from Ecuador said, we are seeing indicators that show that there's a clear reactivation of our economy, indicators that have to do with people in unemployment subsidies, tax collection in Uruguay, activity indicators such as automobile sales or fuel demand. Those indicators shows that activity is recovering, and the estimation that we have of the fall of our economy is 3.5% of our GDP. Quite significant, but compared to other international players, the figure is not as negative as theirs. To finish, I would like to tackle two extra aspects or points. First, we were concentrated in taking a look at what was going on with the pandemic, and the ministers were working in a coordinated matters to prepare the personal protection equipment and the ventilators that we didn't have to use at the very end in our country. We have to be very attentive to these immediate things, but we did so by taking it, but at the same time that we took a look at the midterm. So certain structural things were put on the table, and very early, by mid-July, we passed a law that had a fast track at the parliament, and we are now discussing these new laws in some decrees that we have published, and we've put the table on the structural aspects. We have presented a new governance for public corporations that in the Uruguayan case is different. We're going to present in the coming days the price of the public tariffs that we want to achieve and how we're going to achieve them, because we have some public tariffs that are quite high. Doing an international comparison, we're reforming Social Security that was a pending aspect for many years in Uruguay. We're being proactive in international relations and trying to achieve some results, and we are incentivizing foreign investment. Well, foreign investment and also national investment. Two things that were being studied, and COVID has shown us their sensibility. It has to do with gender equality and environmental issues. at the beginning of the pandemics, Uruguay showed that gender violence is a problem that we have to tackle in a very specific manner with resources in order to stop it. And as to the environmental problems, they have been a concern for all of us. But one of the learnings of these pandemics is that nature can have an important impact, and we have to pay attention to those impacts. That has led to the creation of the Environmental Ministry, and also the Ministry of Economy is actively participating in the forum to attack climate change in the design of economic policies. So the main message that we wanted to put on the table here is that Uruguay is facing the pandemic situation, but also is tackling the structural reforms that we need for the midterm so that we can provide a better quality of life to our citizens, more specifically to the most vulnerable people that are mostly affected by this situation. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I would like to emphasize one of the things that you've said, these first measures that you took, closing the borders, because it's true that these crises have made us look inward into what we're doing in our countries because of supply issues, our needs to contain the pandemics, but I don't know if that could have an impact in cooperation and multilateral relations. And I would like to ask the Vice President of the European Investment Bank if that change is that inward look, because some experts are speaking about certain regression in globalization, if this could impact the cooperation that exists between the EU and Latin America.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. First, I wanted to thank our friends of CAF for having us, and also regarding the question that you have asked. I don't think so. Actually, the pandemic adds risks, complexities, and they have been thoroughly described by the Secretary General for Ibero-America, but Europe is fully aware of the importance of Latin America, the importance of the relationships both at the economic and strategic levels, and there is indeed a wish to revitalize our relationships, and this has been made clear this week precisely in the external trade ministers that has been put for and the external trade meeting for ministers that has been put forward by all of them. And indeed, Latin America is strategically very important for Europe. On the one hand, Europe is the main investor for the region, and it is indeed the main supporter of development aid for the region and a very important trade partner too. But the relationship goes even further because we share values, we have cultural and historical bonds that are very strong, and in the current context where it is even more complex to face the new geostrategic realities that emerge, the relationship between Latin America and Europe can gain greater importance, and Europe can be a reliable and stable partner for Latin America. And especially because, as was mentioned earlier by Alicia, this pandemic has accelerated some of the mega trends that we had observed already in the past. Nationalism, regrettably, is one of the consequences. Also, there's been other consequences from the economic standpoint, like, for instance, the acceleration of digitalization and a lower level of globalization. globally. But at any rate, the bond between Latin America and Europe is still there, and conferences like this one are essential to highlight their importance and continue to work in this direction. And it's been pointed out by the commissioner, by Commissioner Urpilainen. Throughout the pandemics, Europe has deployed a series of measures to support its partners outside of Europe to face the pandemic, and actually Latin America was an important recipient of this strategy. And as part of the Team Europe strategy, we are indeed trying to provide continuous support to the region. And going forward, this is going to gain even more importance because it's obvious that in the region there exist certain vulnerabilities, and the region of Latin America is going to need a very relevant investment flow to support its growth and to solve some vulnerabilities and face challenges going forward. Our bank works in the region, and I would like to highlight two aspects that I consider are very important and that have already been brought up in the beginning, for instance, by the Secretary of State for Economy, Ana de la Cueva. She has pointed it out clearly. It's very important that development banks continue to collaborate. Actually, when our bank collaborates with Latin America, it does it oftentimes precisely in collaboration with regional banks like CAF or BID, and this is going to be key. And on the other hand, another point that has been underlined by Minister Azucena Arbelache, it is indeed very important to support investments in infrastructure, for instance, as have been mentioned. They are key. There is still a gap and a need for infrastructures in the region that needs to receive backing, but also there's other needs, such as, for instance, digitalization or the green transition. And these are efforts that need to be made so that this recovery enables us to rebuild us better. And this is precisely how we gear our efforts. And for instance, I'd say to Mauricio Pozo, to the Minister Mauricio Pozo, that we have important collaborations over there. We have supported the development of the Quito subway network together with the World Bank, and also we've put forward banks to rebuild after the earthquake that took place a few years ago. We are working with technological institutes, and human capital is going to be essential. We need to support it to ensure sustainable growth as part of the response of Team Europe to support the economy and to face the pandemic. We have had some operations in Ecuador, and as I said, joint efforts in this crisis are essential. What this pandemic should teach us is, on the opposite, that social global challenges are solved by working together. Europe and Latin America are precisely in line with these values, as have been for a very long time. Thank you very much, Ms. Vice President. In your statement, you highlighted multilateralism, which has been brought up oftentimes in this exchange of opinions, and we've also talked about strategic changes. I would like Secretary Greenspan to help us interpret some of the changes that we're witnessing in the region. For the first time ever, on one hand, we see USA National face the leader, the Development Bank, Mr. Garefe. China is also playing an essential role in the region. Actually, in some countries, it is one of the main investors, even ahead of some entities, some multinational entities. Europe is indeed a region that has a long tradition in this region. Ms. Secretary, could you help us understand the geostrategic changes that are taking place?
Alicia, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Alicia. The geopolitical changes that we are witnessing affect what some call geoeconomics. I think our panelists are very right to put forward the topic of multilateralism and the geopolitical changes that are occurring in the world. China is currently the main trade partner for 8 countries in Latin America, specifically those countries located in the southern area of the continent. So therefore, Latin America has also become a very important economic player. And let's be honest, the tension between China and the United States is also including the Latin America region as one of the players in that tension. And we consider that in that context, Europe is like a breath of fresh air amidst that tension, so that we are not crushed in that geostrategic fight that is taking place between the United States and China. And we want to indeed foster that we don't have a global scenario with different polarities, multipolar, we could say, but rather a multilateral scenario at the global level. There are many interpretations to multilateralism, and as was already mentioned, Europe and Latin America are a voice to support the strengthening of multilateral organization. I think there are 2 or 3 organizations that I could highlight that actually embody that convergence. One of them is, of course, the World Health Organization that requires strengthening. Another one is the World Trade Organization that has weakened, as we all know, because they haven't renewed their trade conflict resolution courts. And we also have the Paris courts, where Latin America and Europe can converge so that all the aspects brought up by Azucena Emma be tackled towards so that we can move towards a more sustainable and greener economy. When I studied, there weren't colors to be spoken of in economy, but now we talk about green economies, we talk about blue economies, we talk about the white economy of care, the orange economy, that of creativity. So now there's colors to economy, and I think that Europe and Latin America are privileged partners that can push the world in that direction. So indeed, there are complex geopolitical aspects into play, but it will only be channeled if we strengthen multilateralism. And precisely in that sense, Europe and Latin America are partners because they share that objective de facto. And I think that Latin America in the current geopolitical context has the right to choose its partners, of course. It doesn't necessarily have to take a stance being part of crushing positions or clashing positions, rather. I think Latin America can have a greater visibility in the international context, and I think that the capacity that we have to find allies to re-strengthen the global environment following rules, because if we don't have rules, we'll fall down the rift. And I actually feel very similar to Uruguay or Ecuador. I come from Costa Rica, and we don't have the muscle necessary to negotiate in this world on our own. So we need to have a world that allows us to represent our interests as small or mid-sized countries. We need a fairer world in the sense of how power is managed. The countries that are represented here clearly support a more regulated or multilateral world, but we need to have allies in order to go into this whole new world, because some forces try to take us in the wrong direction, in the opposite direction, actually. Emma was saying how the pandemic has proven the importance of joint action, precisely because it is a global pandemic. And as was mentioned by the Minister of Ecuador and the Minister of Uruguay, there are pulling forces, opposing forces, and forces that are taking us not towards a national response, but rather towards a nationalistic response. Therefore, we need to unite and gather forces to combat those that go in the opposite direction and lead us astray. And also in Europe, that's precisely something that I wanted to pick up on, because I didn't want the opportunity to go by. We have the Minister of Uruguay here, and one of the landmarks that appeared in that cooperation was finally the trade agreement between the European Union, Mercosur. After decades of negotiations, apparently it was coming to fruition, but now, as you pointed out, Ms. Secretary, it seems like it's left to die. So what do you think about this? What do you think about Mercosur, Ms. Minister? Perfect. Thank you very much, Alicia, for the question. First, I wanted to make Uruguay's position clear in this pandemic regarding protectionism, because at a very early stage, the government made clear over here that the call to stay at home, do telework, come closer to our families, that could mislead us to think that we were closing up the country and increasing protectionism. It was rather the opposite. A small country such as Uruguay has a lot at stake in terms of its growth and the well-being of Uruguayans. We need an open economy, and we need to receive investment and cooperation from the rest of the world. So I do echo what Ms. Emma said. There are great problems when there's a pandemic, and the response needs to be provided jointly, and the challenge needs to be provided all together. So indeed, the response needs to be further trade, more investment, more cooperation. Now, regarding Mercosur, in this half year, Uruguay has the pro tempore presidency of Mercosur. Both myself as well as the representative have claimed that we are going to make every effort possible to take action in this aspect. And if we don't find a way to strike an agreement, we will find the necessary mechanisms so that we can have sounder relationships and so that we can yield specific results to exchange products in more beneficial situations. In Uruguay, we pay very high duties, especially with products in the agricultural industry, and this is a burden for all Uruguayans, and at the end of the day, this results in lower growth rates. As the Minister of Ecuador said, employment is essential as of now, and Uruguay has been clear on that subject matter. One of the main challenges in our socio-economic policy is to increase employment rates, and in order to do that, we need further growth, inclusive growth, following the characteristics that I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about inclusion and comprising the concept of gender equality, and also we need growth that will render the result of increasing employment rates for all Uruguayans. And in order for that to happen, we need more and better trade. I would like to wrap it up on a positive note, because the situation is complicated across the board. And I would like to deliver an optimistic message. I hope that each one of you can talk about the opportunities that open up. What opportunities emerge in spite of the difficult situation? What are the opportunities for the relationship between Latin America and Europe? Secretary, let us start with you. In Europe and Latin America, we need to put our bets on climate change and environmental sustainability. We also need to foster gender equality together. We need to foster multilateralism together. And if you allow me, we need to foster the future for the youth together. We are a very young region, and there's many opportunities to build a different future, and Europe can be, as has already been mentioned, a privileged partner for us to tackle all these objectives, abiding by the values that have always been core in the relationship between Europe and Latin America. Minister? I think that these realities have led us to reconsider some of our decisions, but our decisions always bear the relationship between countries in mind. Our countries live out of our international relationships, and that means that we need to make the best of the opportunities ahead of us. We have signed an agreement with Europe relatively recently, 3 years ago, and we are going together down that path. We need to have cooperation in place. We need to have the right approaches to the economy combined with the environment, and we need to have policies in place to manage the equity issues that are in place in the country. These are all aspects that we mustn't forget. And what has happened in the past regarding the reaction capacity of countries when facing the difficult situations that have emerged, well, I think that opens up a new scenario that allows us to be optimistic, because the relationship between Latin America and Europe has settled because we have been able to react to an unprecedented situation like the one that we're living, and that has brought up opportunities. So I think that the best cooperation that can be in place between Europe and Latin America and its countries, the support that can be received by the international markets and by multilateral banks, I think all those open up great opportunities so that the economic recovery processes can happen faster, and so that countries can go back to normality as soon as possible, and in this manner go back to the path towards growth. Minister, where do opportunities lie? Well, as I said in the beginning, we have the opportunity to tackle all problems with a renewed perspective, with a more unique approach. And thanks to the tradition of the values that are shared with Europe, I think we can obtain specific results in terms of cooperation, supporting gender equality, supporting the environment, and on the trade sphere. Uruguay needs more and better trade with Europe, because this will allow us to have more growth and create more job positions for Uruguayans, which is the greatest challenge that we have ahead of us. And Vice President, The economic and political relationships between Latin America and the European Union in the current context are even more important, and it's essential to delve deeper into that relationship, revitalize it, and reinforce it. And we are going to have very important partners in Latin America for the economic recovery and for future challenges. And the Development Bank needs to collaborate. The Bay is willing to do it, to collaborate with the CAF and other banks in the region, to collaborate and foster those investments. Thank you very much, everybody. And I think that messages have been made clear. Investment, cooperation, multilateralism. We must trust that this is the way it will go. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Agradecemos a Rebeca Greenspan, a Mauricio Pozo.
We would like to thank Irma Navarra, Rebecca Greenspan, Susana Reche, Alicia González, and of course Emma Navarro, the moderator, for having been with us in this panel. And it's not just about this crisis, it's about making the best of the opportunity. We were hearing the participants in this panel because they were talking about the opportunity that this poses to face climate change and to tackle the issue of gender equality, foster multilateralism, and an aspect that I considered very important is also strengthening the momentum of young people, because as we mentioned, Latin America has many young people, so it's the right time to support them, and it's the right time also to support collaboration and to emphasize all trade aspects, because Latin America needs more and better trade relationships with Europe, and in this sense Europe can play a key role. And in this context, this gives us a very good opportunity to strengthen the relationship between Latin America and Europe. Investments are going to be key, and it's the right time to foster the activities of development banks. We're talking about an unprecedented crisis that arises from COVID-19. This has impacted Europe as well as Latin America. This crisis is obvious, it hasn't yet been overcome, but regional governments are now working on economic reactivation. And at this point, investing in physical and digital infrastructures can be key and can be a true growth driver. Now, this is precisely the topic for our second panel, and in order to delve deeper into this topic, we would like to welcome Narciso Casado, as Permanent Secretary of the Ibero-American Businessman Council, the THEIB, who will be the moderator in the second panel. But before we get started, I would like to remind you that you can share your opinion on social media, use the hashtag EuropaCAF, and follow our account AgendaCAF on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
¿Hablo? ¿Sí? Buenas tardes, buenos días.
Good afternoon and good morning.
Buenos días a todos al otro lado del Atlántico.
Good morning to everybody.
Sigo. Quisiera saludar especialmente a todas las personas que están con nosotros hoy. Me dicen que es un récord, más de 5.000. Europa, América Latina, una alianza importante. Agradecer a CAF.
It is extremely important, and we would like to thank CAF. We're already on the air. I thought we were just testing. I didn't know we were
Buenas
live.
tardes, buenos días a todos al otro
Good
lado
afternoon,
del
good morning
Atlántico.
to everybody
Yo
on the other
quisiera,
side
en
of the
primer lugar,
pond. I
saludar
would like,
muy
first of all,
brevemente a todas las
to
personas
briefly
que
say
nos
hello
acompañan
to
hoy
all the people who
en
join
esta
us
importante
here today
conferencia
in
de
this
CAF
very
que
important
organiza
CAF
anualmente
meeting
y que
that
lleva
it
como
is
título las
organized on a
relaciones
yearly basis
Europa-América
and that it is
Latina, una alianza
entitled
para
The
la
Relationships
recuperación
Between
económica
Europe and Latin
Y
America,
quisiera
an
felicitar a
alliance
CAF,
for
a su
economic
presidente
recovery.
ejecutivo,
And I
Luis
would like to
Carranza, y
congratulate
a su
CAF,
equipo
the
por el gran
Executive
programa
Vice
que han
President Luis
organizado y
Carranza and
por
his whole team for the
la
wonderful program
numerosísima
they've organized and for
público, el
the
numerosísimo público que nos
large
está siguiendo. Es un honor
public
para
that's
mí
following our
poder intervenir
conversation, our
desde
panel.
Casa de
It is
América y
a
moderar
great
este
pleasure
segundo
for me
panel.
to
No es
participate
la primera
from
vez que
here, from
participo en
Casa
eventos
de
de CAF.
América, and to
Quisiera
moderate
destacar
this
la
panel. It's not
colaboración
the
que
first
existe
time
entre el
that
banco,
I
la
participate
COE y
in
el
a
Consejo de
CAF
Empresarios Iberoamericanos, CEIB. Para
situation.
nosotros,
And
CAF
for
se ha
us, CAF
convertido en
has
un aliado
become an
estratégico.
strategic
Y hoy
ally.
vamos a hablar de
And today we're
infraestructuras
going to be talking about
físicas y digitales
infrastructures,
y de
physical
recuperación.
and digital
Permítanme
infrastructures,
unos
and
breves
we're going to talk
comentarios para
about
enmarcar
recovery.
el tema antes de
Let me
pasar
make a few comments so that
coloquio
we
y al
can
debate.
frame the topic
Recuerdo
before
que a
moving
principio de este
into
año el
the
presidente
debate
ejecutivo de
session.
CAF,
I remember
Luis
that at the
Carranza,
beginning of the year,
aseguraba
the
justo en
executive
nuestra sede, en
president
la
of
sede de la
CAF
COE,
said
que
in
las
our
oportunidades de América
headquarters, the
Latina se
headquarters of
concentraban
the
en los ámbitos de
Entrepreneurs
desarrollo logístico,
Organization
lo que
said
suponía
that the
potenciar la
activities were in the
eficiencia
logistic
para lo que
area
las
that meant
infraestructuras
to
eran fundamentales.
foster the
Las infraestructuras son
efficiency,
sin
and
duda un
infrastructures were
elemento
fundamental for
dinamizador
that.
del
Infrastructures
crecimiento
are
económico
an
a
element that
través de la
dynamize
mejora de la
economic
productividad
growth through
y como
improving our
consolidación
productivity and as a
del desarrollo social
consolidation of the
mediante la
social
reducción de la
development
pobreza y
by
del fomento de
reducing
la clase
poverty
media.
and
En
by
América Latina hay una gran
increasing the
necesidad de
middle class.
inversión
In Latin
que
America,
nos
there was
permita
a great
fomentar la
need of
equidad,
investment
el
that will
desarrollo de
allow
los
us to
entornos de las
foster
ciudades,
equity,
el
the
desarrollo
development
social y
of the
educativo y el
areas
desarrollo
surrounding the
institucional.
cities, the social
Los
and economic
expertos
development, and the
aseguran que es
institutional
crucial
development. Experts
apostar por
said
un
that it
pacto
is
por la
absolutely
productividad
essential to
que
support
implica comprometer a los
productivity,
gobiernos no
meeting the
solamente en lo relativo
governments not
a la
only on
construcción
the
física
things
de
that have to do
infraestructuras,
with the
sino
physical
también en todo lo
construction of
relativo a regulación,
infrastructures, but in all
facilidades
the things that
aduaneras y
have
por
to do
descontado
with
en el
regulation,
fomento de las llamadas
custom
alianzas
facilities,
público y
and
privadas.
establishing
El
public-private
concepto de
alliances
infraestructura
or
física como tal
partnerships. The
surgió en la
concept of
última
physical
cumbre iberoamericana
infrastructure
de jefes de Estado de Gobierno que
was
se
tackled
celebró
in
en
the
la
last
antigua Guatemala en 2018 y en la
Ibero-American
que se
Summit,
reconocía que la
Latin
infraestructura de
American
transporte en América
Caribbean
Latina
as well,
mostraba un
in
retraso general en relación
2018,
con las
and it showed
necesidades
that the level
actuales
of
y futuras,
infrastructures in Latin America
especialmente
showed a certain
comparándolo con
delay
otras
compared to
regiones
the
con rentas
current
similares.
and future
Por
needs,
ello,
especially
los líderes
compared to other
iberoamericanos
regions of
coincidieron en
similar
aquel
income.
momento
That's why the Latin
en
American
apostar por
leaders
la
decided at
conectividad
that
e
time to
integración
support
eficiente de toda la cadena
connectivity,
logística, que
efficient
depende
integration of
no
all the
solo de la
logistic
infraestructura de
chain that
transporte,
depends not only
sino
on
también
the
de otros
road
factores como
infrastructure
los
or
marcos regulatorios
transportation
y las
infrastructure, but
políticas
also
públicas.
depend on regulatory
El
framework
desarrollo
and
en
public
América Latina
policies.
se ve
The
fuertemente
development in
afectado
Latin America
por
has
la
been
falta de
strongly
inversión en
impacted by
infraestructura.
the lack of
Por ello, los
infrastructure
esfuerzos que en este
investment.
sentido
That's
realicen
why
los
the
gobiernos
efforts
y
done
los
by the
organismos
governments and by
multilaterales de financiación
multilateral financing
serán fundamentales,
organizations will be
especialmente en la
fundamental,
etapa post-COVID a la
especially
que nos
after the
dirigimos.
COVID
En lo
and
relativo a
the
innovación y transformación
post-COVID
digital,
stage.
seguro
With
que los
regards to
expertos van a ahondar en estas
digitalization and
cuestiones a
digital
lo largo
transformation, I'm
del
sure the
panel.
experts were going to talk
De cara a
about
la
all of these
recuperación económica
aspects in this
post-COVID,
panel,
no
but
bastará
for
solo
the
con
economic
desarrollar
recovery after the COVID,
infraestructuras
it will
físicas en la región,
we
sino que
cannot be
debemos
limited to
impulsar
develop
y
physical
potenciar la infraestructura
infrastructures, but
digital.
we also
Y
have
ya de
to
forma
foster
telegráfica,
the
algunos
creation of
mensajes que
digital
pueden servir para el debate y
infrastructures
que han
and
surgido
some messages
en
that
los
could be
foros y
helpful
trabajos
for
que
the
venimos
debate and
desarrollando
that
desde CEIB,
have
con la
arisen
Secretaría
in the
General
different works that
Iberoamericana y
we've
la
done with
Federación Iberoamericana
FEI,
de Jóvenes
with the
Empresarios, en los que
Ibero-American
CAF ha tenido
Association of
mucha
Young
presencia también
Entrepreneurs, with
y que hemos
which we
venido
have
desarrollando a lo
worked
largo de estos
very
meses.
hard and we
La
have
digitalización
debated
no
in
es
the
una opción,
in the last
sino
months.
absolutamente
Digitalization
necesaria
is not an
y ha
option.
llegado para
It's absolutely
quedarse.
necessary and is here
Facilita
to
las
stay.
oportunidades
It
de interacción,
facilitates
de
integration
reinvención de
opportunity,
los sistemas,
reinvention of the
protocolos de
systems,
trabajo y relaciones
changing the working
profesionales.
protocols, and it
Iberoamérica tiene
changes
en la
working
transformación digital
relationships. Latin
una
America
enorme
has in the digital
oportunidad para
transformation a
mejorar
huge
su
opportunity ahead of
productividad,
them to
siendo
improve their
este uno de los grandes
productivity,
problemas de las
being
empresas en
this
la
one of the
región.
main problems of the
En este tema
corporations
también
in
CAF ha
that
tenido un
region.
papel
And in
importante
that
en
sense,
la elaboración
CAF
de
has
informes.
played a very important
Necesitamos, si
role
queremos,
preparing
una
many
transformación
reports.
digital
If
inclusiva.
we want an
Lo
inclusive
comentaba
digital
la Secretaria General
transformation,
Iberoamericana en muchísimas
as said
ocasiones y también los expertos. Y es
the
clave el
Secretary before, it is key access to digital technology in order to face productive gaps. Entrepreneurship, innovation are pillars that are necessary to tackle the transformation challenge, and to that we have to add the ability of collaboration. Interaction between innovation and productivity is the most appropriate formula for the Latin American development. These are the aspects that I wanted to make clear before
que seguro que van a crear un poco la estructura de este debate. Vamos a dar paso al panel en el que van a intervenir Antonio Silveira, vicepresidente de Infraestructura de CAF, Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina, que va a analizar el impacto de la pandemia del COVID-19 en la región y los mecanismos de apoyo para la reactivación económica. Carmen Gisela Vergara, directora ejecutiva de Panamá, Luis Castilla, CEO de Infraestructura de Acciona, Philippe Deleu, vicepresidente senior de Asuntos Públicos de Alstom, vicepresidente Antonio tiene la palabra.
Senior of Public Affairs from Alstom. We give the floor to Mr. Silveira. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure for me to give you a warm welcome, as well as saying hello to the other panelists and all the attendants to this conference. We can show a very brief presentation, PowerPoint presentation. Let me share the screen with all our attendees.
¿Pueden cargarla, por favor? Muy bien.
¿Perdón?
Perfecto. Empezamos. Bien, señores, señores.
Sí, Antonio, no sé si nos escucha.
Antonio, I don't know if you can hear us, but we cannot hear you from here.
Déjame ver.
Ahora sí.
Okay, now we're ready. Everything is ready now.
No, perfecto. Mire, empecemos. 2019 fue un año que
2019 was a year that was very hurtful for Latin America. In many countries, we suffered recession problems, and we suffered some political and social crisis. And we were facing 2020 as a recovery opportunity. Unfortunately, we were also impacted by COVID, and we started feeling it at the end of February, beginning of March, and the expectations for the year worsened. Consequently, and you can see this on this first graph, how our expectations dropped and dropped until August. August was the worst recession of all times in Latin America. Those are the countries affected by the pandemic, and all of them reacted, passing some fiscal stimulus packages. We decided to provide a minimum revenue to the population, minimum income to the population, as a way of trying to immediately fight the pandemic, which produced a suspension of all the physical connectivity in our trade flows, urban flows, impacting highly the area or the infrastructure sectors. The impact of infrastructures were seen in three different areas, impacting the demand, impacting the adjustment of certain tariffs that were closed by the government in order to reduce the impact that it could have on the population, and as you can see in this table, the impacts on the different sectors: energy, telecom, public transportation, aviation, and sea transportation. We saw a 36% drop. Telecommunication, the demand increased because people was looking for digital connectivity, but also the levels of default and the levels of the delinquency increased. Public transportation and sea transportation increased. Port traffic were deeply impacted.
Muchos de los concesionarios pasaron a tener sistemas de liquidez,
this
que motivaram
situation,
ações governamentais
we were
e
facing some
multilaterais
problems. We had some
prover
multilateral
linhas de
problems.
liquidez para garantizar os serviços
We
e
had no
garantizar a saúde
liquidity to
financeira
guarantee
destes
financial
concessionários.
health
Então, esse
of
quadro é
these
extremamente importante, inclusive para mirar
concessions,
essa futuro,
and this was
para as
extremely
ações que vamos ter
important
que
for the
arreglar do
actions that
ponto de
we're
vista
going
dos
to
países,
have to
com a assistência dos
fix
sócios de desenvolvimento dos
with
sistemas
the help
multilaterais,
of
em especial da
partners
CAF.
on multilateral systems.
Para mirar como contestar a pergunta desta sessão,
To see how to answer
infraestrutura como
the
motor de
questions
reactivação,
in this session, the role of
Partimos del
infrastructure as the driver
pré-pandemia.
for reactivation, we
Como mencionou Narciso em sua
start
introdução,
from three
Latinoamérica tem
aspects.
importantes
As
brechas em
Mrs.
infraestrutura
As it says
que
in the
provocam
introduction, we
temas
have different
de
gaps on our
competitividade,
infrastructure
afetam a
that
produtividade
worsens our
e que
competitiveness, have an
necessitam
impact on our
inversões anuais
productivity, and that
de algo
require
cerca de
yearly
13,2
investment of around
bilhões
$13.2
de dólares
billion
al año
per
para cerrar
year in order
la brecha
to
en un
close
plazo ahí de
this
20
gap
años.
in a
Pero, por
20-year
supuesto,
period. But
el
of
primer
course,
impacto
the first
y la primera
impact
reacción
and the
en la
first
pandemia
reaction
fue
in
con
the
un tema
pandemic
de,
was with
podemos
an
llamar de
issue
política
of
anticíclica,
cyclical policy. I think we can
pero
call it that way.
exatamente para
But
sostener mínimo de actividade
this was to
essencial
sustain a
em los
minimum
países
of essential
uma
activity
situação
in the countries
novedosa,
in
porque
quite
já
novel
tínhamos nos
situation
olvidado de lo que
because
passou
we had
no
already
início do
forgotten
século
what
XX,
happened at the beginning of the 20th century.
por aí tentar garantizar o mínimo necessário às
And we
populações.
had to guarantee the
Uma etapa
necessary
seguinte,
minimum to
que agora
the
estamos adentrando, a inversão em infraestrutura
situation.
pode
So
se
we're
apalancar
now
processo
trying to
de
use
recuperação.
infrastructure
Pero
to
hay que
leverage
mirarlo de
on
uma
it for the
forma
recovery process, but
estratégica,
we have to
vendo
see this
lo que es
aspect from a
necesario de
strategic
acciones en el corto
perspective,
plazo
seeing
y
what are the
desarrollando una
necessary actions in
planificación
the short term
adecuada
and
con
developing the
esquemas de
necessary
financiación
planning
adecuados
with the
para el
right
mediano y para el largo plazo.
financing schemes for the mid and the long
En una
term.
región
So
donde
in a
sabemos
region where
que
we
hay un
know
déficit
that there
importante,
is an important
de proyectos bien
deficit
estructurados y
of
bancables, la
well-structured
primera reacción
projects and
en
bankable
términos de
projects,
inversión en
our first
infraestructura
reaction in
tiene que
terms of
buscar
investment and infrastructure
esquemas sencillos
have to
que
look
puedan
for
movilizar
simple schemes
rápidamente
that can
población
fastly
y generar ingresos para empezar una
move the
transición
population
desde
and
los
create
programas de
income to
soporte de
create a
ingresos mínimos a la
transition for
población
the
de
programs
transferencia
to support
para sistemas de
these
generación
programs
de empleo.
towards programs that will create
Por
jobs.
esto, hoy vemos que
That's why
el
we're
arranque
seeing today how
es necesario mirar actividades como programas de
we need to
mantenimiento,
take a look at some activities such as maintenance programs that can be fastly executed. We have to take a look at ways of leveraging in the collectivity, even looking at integration, and of course a challenge that we had in the past and has deepened and have accelerated now is to generate the digital capacities that have to do with infrastructures, but not only with infrastructure, it also has to do with human capital, and it also has to do with practically all of the activities of these sectors. This is very important because for every $1 billion invested in infrastructure, we generate around 40,000 jobs. We create 40,000 jobs. These are IMF estimations in the last fiscal monitoring report. Also, for every 1% of increase of investment in infrastructure, we have a 20% of economic growth. So those are the job and revenue indicators or multipliers that we're using. Seeing this as a way of mobilizing simple programs or simple projects to have an immediate impact, but it is also necessary to take a look at the future and to provide adapted financing systems. We already have a series of initiatives implemented. We're working in order to improve the liquidity not only for the governments but also for the owners of these concessions that operate the infrastructures, and we're also giving facilities to guarantee to the region that we're going to have the means to face this recovery challenge. In a very schematic way, I would like to take a look at these things in three different stages. Stage one is the emergency stage that we've already spoken about a little bit. Stage two is the stage that we are covering here today, which is the recovery stage. And stage three has a name that I don't like very much, but it is very fashionable, which is the stage of the new normal. And we'll only make some general observations about it at the very end. How did CAF reacted in stage one? We had a credit line for the COVID emergency. This was extremely relevant, and this was for climatic extreme situations that we use it immediately, implemented all of the facilities, and we also have a cyclical facilities given to us by Development Bank and associated to the CAF and for financial intermediaries to reach not only the governments that needed extra leverage, but also to provide microcredit to small and medium-sized corporations as a way of helping them in this anti-cyclical effort. For the recovery stage, we are already working with many countries in the rural areas, the pavement, we're working on public spaces, we're talking with the governments in these execution processes, etc., and more specifically developing financial products to improve digital connectivity so that we can bridge those gaps and to provide a good digital integration for our countries. With this effort, CAF is looking to the longer term, and we have to guarantee that the countries have now the capacity of overcoming this difficult moment, overcoming the immediate challenge of moving forward with the economic recovery, but also facing a mid-long-term challenge that is going to be extremely difficult. Carrying out a fiscal consolidation together with managing projects of social and economic infrastructure that will help us to bridge gaps, especially digitalization gaps, because that will improve our competitiveness and our productivity in a very efficient way, but also preventing a situation, a social regression, taking us back to the 80s, early 90s of the past century. That's the big challenge that we have at CAF. So we're doing that with CAF, with their credit operations, the technical support, and with their knowledge in order to guarantee that the countries overcome these challenges the best way possible. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Vice President. Now we're going to focus on the two and third phases, the one of recovery and the one of this name that we all hate, the one of the new normal. And I'm thinking about a comment that will give rise to a question that I would like to formulate to the three panelists. Can infrastructure investment be the response to reactivate economies in the short term and improve the competitiveness in the long term, as the Vice President said? In the case of Panama, Ambassador Garamendi, I'm saying hello to you. It's a pleasure to see you. What's the perspective of the Central Americanismo and of Panama in this topic? Good morning to everybody. First of all, I would like to thank CAF for this invitation and also say hello to Antonio for this wonderful presentation that shows the current situation that we're living, and we have to concentrate on how we're going to do things in the future was here to come. And my special hello to Narciso and to all the team. Narciso, very much love here in Panama. With regards to your question,
La inversión en infraestructura es un importante motor.
with regards to your question, the investment in infrastructure is an important driver for the growth in the region. The construction sector in Panama represented more than 20% of the GDP and 9% of employment in the year 2019. The activity in construction normally works as an indicator of the good health of the economy because it's the result of the investment, both public and private, looking to satisfy their own needs for urban development that could be speed up as we have more resources for consumption, for example, building for your own use, as well as for investment in infrastructure and buildings for commercial use. So it has come the moment to measure the levels of progress and recovery in the local sphere. Here in Panama, construction companies can already reestablish administrative and operational activities ever since September 12th, and they have been working with a restricted schedule in the development of certain public works, and the Ministry of Public Works in Panama presented to the Ministry of Health and were approved. They did those works and they have been working on it in those projects. We're talking about 15 projects that add more than $23 million to participate in a tender and that are going to be part of this program for economic reactivation. But also we're talking about projects that are working on the reactivation, such as the extension of the Tocumen Airport with a second terminal building that was inaugurated by mid-July and with the cost that overcome the $900 million. However, this project was almost ready because by January this year, the level of advancement of these works was more than 98%, and we're having the subway line, and this was inaugurated, the expansion program on line 2, going from the downtown to the airport, and that will add a new line of 3-4 kilometers so that people can go by subway to the airport, and on the other way around, from the airport to downtown. The fourth bridge on the channel, this is an investment of $1.4 billion, and the new line 3 of the subway value of 500 million euros that will start construction in 2021. So there we have a scheme for economic recovery in public infrastructure, but also in the private sector. We're seeing the reactivation of the construction sector in the building of social housing and tourist resorts in Central America. You know that we're all working based on a policy, the regional framework for mobility that has been approved by all of the countries, and that is done through the Central America Secretariat, Economic Secretariat, TIECA, together with the Council of Ministers of Transportation, and that participate or get together in contract. These framework policies include a master plan for infrastructure supported by JICA. Well, the two of them, the policy framework as well as the master plan, have been supported by JICA, and we've established the future infrastructure needs that will have to be carried out in Central America so that we can become a logistics center, taking the region as a whole and not in separate countries. And we've analyzed the type of infrastructures needed by the region so that we can have a real connectivity. And in this case, in Mesoamerica, this is another process that is being carried out within the Central American region, but including Mexico and Colombia. We're also developing like a mirror project of this political framework, and it also has a strategy of sea transportation, short distance, that promote the re-skilling of these harbors as an alternative for cargo shipment that is normally done by road with all the programs associated to it, not only in terms of road infrastructures, but security problems and the delays in the border ports or harbors. Apart from these Panamanian projects in Central America, we know that the countries are supporting the building of airports, roads, logistics centers, projects, energetic projects, water treatment plants, amongst others, to increase the competitiveness of the region. And amongst the most important projects, we have Line 3 of the subway in Panama, the gas pipeline Guatemala to Honduras, and the system for fast transportation of the big metropolitan area in Costa Rica with an amount of $1.4 billion. So the region, as you can see, and more specifically Panama, are clearly supporting the development of infrastructures, not only as part of our recovery process and because of the jobs that it can create, but also looking forward into the future, because we know that these infrastructures can help us to increase our competitiveness at a regional level and also productivity as well. Thank you, Gisela. We're going to go back to stage one, as mentioned by the Vice President of CAF, thinking about solutions and thinking about the future. And I was wondering, how has COVID impacted the projects of the representatives of the companies that are here with us? In the case of Acciona, Luis, what was your experience? Please let us know, and please tell us what measures can be taken by the governments in order to reactivate the sector. And this is for the future, and then we'll go into phase two. Thank you very much for your question. I understand the first part of your question, how we've been impacted at Acciona, our company. And it has impacted us in a very different way depending on the country and depending on the activities. In Latin America, we do things in renewable energy, water infrastructure, social infrastructures, in investment, construction, and operation. Obviously, the most essential activities such as the energy, water treatment, hospital services, we've been a bit more resilient and we've been able to cope better, but there are other activities that have suffered more. In the specific aspect of the implementation of projects, the behavior has been very different from one country to another. There have been projects, I don't want to name them because I don't think it's necessary, but some nervous behaviors have meant the total paralyzation of the building of certain infrastructures, and I don't think this is the way to move on. But there have been other countries that have behaved very, very differently. This depends on the different public administration running the contracts, and they have had a more cooperating attitude of moving forward. So very different behaviors. In general terms, we've been medium highly impacted, but we are clearly recovering and we are optimistic when thinking about the future. And as to the reflections that I would like to make, I would like to recommend regional, national, municipal governments and public authorities in general not to stop the activities that are related with infrastructure, neither the implementation nor the maintenance, neither the construction nor the maintenance. I agree, maintenance of infrastructure is essential. It's essential to recover fast. So my first recommendation is not to stop this type of activities related with infrastructure. Both construction and maintenance activities have shown after the initial shock that we all suffer that they are capable of coexisting. And I'm saying so from our Acciona platform. We work in more than 40 countries in the main regions in the world, but we have been able to live with the pandemic. We just need good collaboration between the public and the private sector. We just need to establish the rules of the game. We need to protect very well the workers and society at large, and activity can go on and can be maintained with no problem. These are activities that are compatible. Stopping construction activity is the worst possible solution because we're not advancing in the search for multiplying effects that give some return to society, as it normally does with the construction activity, and it is not solving anything. It has been improving in the vast majority of the countries of the world. We have been able to prove that if you do your activities correctly, you can continue on doing them. And my second reflection, and I think this is something that's going to be good, I think it's necessary in Latin America, in Europe as well, and in other areas, it's very necessary to do a very deep reflection about the contractual models that we have in place right now. This is a topic that will give rise to a full-day conference, but the current contractual models that we have, not only in our country, but in all of the countries in which CAF is located and in other geographical areas, they started with legal pillars of the beginning of the 20th century, and some of them of the 19th century. We've hardly evolved. And if we're looking for faster and more flexible solutions and faster returns, we have to do so with new types of contracts and new ways of working that are more flexible and more collaborative. And they exist, and there are big enough examples that prove that they work.
We're going to continue talking about that a bit later, but in the case of Ashton, Philip, the same question goes out to you. How has COVID impacted Ashton projects in the region, and what measures could be taken by governments to reactivate the industry? I am sure that the issue of contractual models and not paralyzing construction will arise in your answer. Philip, whenever you want.
To avoid choosing between Spanish and Portuguese, if I may, I will speak English. So first, I would like to thank for the invitation to this summit and this conference. Well, I would say that Latin America was not different on this aspect from other regions in the world. Of course, we have faced difficulties. Alstom is responsible for executing projects of transport and also to manufacture trains in our factories in Latin America. So we had some difficult weeks, but I would say that all our workers have shown a fantastic resilience to continue their activities as much as possible. Now we have to look ahead, of course, and as it has been already said, infrastructure is, of course, one element of the answer to the present situation, because we know that there is a double benefit with infrastructure. First, to answer to specific and big needs in Latin America as elsewhere, and also to bring activity. I would add one additional element that have not been very much discussed since the beginning of this conference. I'm fully convinced that this is a fantastic opportunity if we want to be a little bit optimistic with this very difficult situation, is that since there is a lot of money that is put in the economy for the recovery plans, and there the development banks have a very important role to play. This is also a fantastic moment to accelerate the environmental transition. And this opportunity should not be lost. And of course, in our mobility sector, this is maybe more important than in many other sectors. So really, to answer to your question, I absolutely, as you have imagined, agree with Luis have just said. This is not a surprise since we have some success together with Acciona in Latin America. What I think is that I would say two main elements. First, in order to have this double benefit, Latin America should not forget that it should also support technology within Latin America. We have in Latin America fantastic expertise in mobility, and really the projects should be realized, giving the possibility for this Latin America technology to benefit and to participate to the projects, and not only technology coming from elsewhere. And that's an important point because it has to be incorporated within the way the projects are tendered. And second, there is, of course, this aspect of contractual models. And frankly speaking, on this aspect, my message is that please do not reinvent what is well known all over the world. We know that there are projects, models that work, and we know that there are some models that don't work. And on that aspect, I would like to congratulate Panama. We have the chance to participate very actively to the projects that have been presented by Carmen. And why it has been a success in Panama? Because there have been continuity in the planification. And this is unfortunately still too rare in Latin America, but this is a major element of success for infrastructure projects.
Gracias, Philippe. Yo me quedaría con...
Thank you very much, Philip. I would also go back to those messages, optimism on the recovery plans, and most importantly, your second message, Latin American technology for Latin America. In CIB and in CEGIBE, we have a motto which is called More Ibero-American, bet put on the region. And I think we can go back to this point later on in the discussion, but we are going to now move on to a second round of intervention. A second round of questions. Antonio Silveira, Vice Chairman of CAF. Could you please talk to us about the roles of the public and private sectors in infrastructure investment for recovery? What's your perspective at CAF? Thank you very much for the question, Narciso. In the region right now, the situation is that both the private and the public sectors have been impacted seriously by the pandemic. So there needs to be room for both. Sharing the room and sharing the public budget are going to be a great challenge. Indeed, apps are extremely important, and in that sense, there is another very important issue that Luis and Philippe touched upon, which is legal certainty in the contracts that we right now have in apps. And that's extremely important because everything that happened in the pandemic, many contracts actually will have to undergo rebalancing processes. There will be a need for restructuring, and judicial maturity to manage this is very essential. We've also seen new guarantee and finances agreements that have tried to help balance, support the effort. There is the opportunity for the public sector, the bilateral sector, or global initiatives to provide collateral funds. For instance, there can be swaps for sovereign guarantees or collaterals in order to guarantee not just financial availability but also adequate fees to leverage the private sector in its effort. So I think we will need public investment for starters and for those projects that can be bankerized, as we call them. We will have to activate private investment strongly, but bearing in mind this environment and bearing in mind the support that is needed in the private investment sector to indeed face the situation, the complicated situation that we have right now. Thank you very much. Carmen, Ambassador Carmen Gisela, as from your position, what is the importance of developing productive infrastructures to support the economic recovery of your country? What is the role to be played? Thank you very much, Narciso. We consider that infrastructures are very important, and indeed President Laurentino Cortizo, in the first speech to the nation that he delivered in June 1st, he talked about the National Reactivation Plan, and he mentioned that the main pillars for this plan will be rebuilding and attracting direct foreign investment. And in this case, both aspects are closely related. Productive infrastructures are essential to promote trade and tourism, and therefore they are integrated part of the competitiveness of all countries. But as part of that, we shouldn't just include the construction sector and projects that I mentioned earlier, but also, as Philippe touched upon, we also need to include connectivity. For instance, connectivity is a virtual information highway, and that helps us conduct very important transactions. And with the pandemics, those transactions have been put at the forefront of the economic recovery process. Actually, the gaps that exist in the countries have gained more relevance now that they have had to include IT technologies to communicate with one another and to promote their products on e-commerce. Panama is currently involved in this process, the process of modernizing and implementing communications infrastructures. In order to support all these communication infrastructures in Panama, we have the 7 underwater optic fiber cables that cross the isthmus and connect us with the Caribbean and Eurasia. We are planning on having 2 further cables to improve the connectivity in Panama. And in line with this, very recently, we passed a law to improve communication. And indeed, for connectivity purpose, we have a very special situation in Panama. And indeed, this pandemic has made it essential for our recovery process. And regarding physical infrastructures in Panama, we have large-scale projects, like, for instance, the extension of the channel. When it was built last century, it was one of the main infrastructure works in this continent. And in this century, we've also had the extension of the Panama Channel, and it's been one of the most important building projects in Panama too. And that entailed a very important growth in the construction sector, and there have been many effects that we have been able to also use in other segments. And also the harbor and port sector has flourished thanks to foreign investment, and it's linked to the development of the Panama Channel too, and has helped us also foster other niches, like for instance the building of shipyards, and this has of course helped us foster the logistics sector that also goes through the channel. And in the airport we are also finishing building the second terminal that will also help us gather and redistribute goods in Panama. And we also have the subway line, and the subway line is being extended in both directions towards the airport and also crossing the channel for dorm cities that are also located at the other side of the channel, and that can connect them with the capital city. So this infrastructure makes Panama an ideal place for manufacturing companies to be settled, and they will be able to use our logistic infrastructure to transfer their products to international markets. And in order to do so, we also have very important migratory and fiscal incentives that make our offer even more compelling. And of course, we can use nearshoring trends, which have also arisen as a result of the company. And we've seen very important changes in supply and distribution chain that have become more regional and not so global. And there have also been changes in consumer preferences arising from the pandemics, not just in terms of the goods that they consume, but also in terms of how they consume them, and this indeed opens up a new development perspective. So as you can see, infrastructures are for us, when we talk about built infrastructures, communication infrastructures, they are both a very important industry for our economy, and in the process of economic reactivation, we will continue to support them to offer employment solutions that will enable a faster recovery for our country. Thank you, Carmen Gisela. I was telling the infrastructure CEO for Acciona, Luis Castilla, that we were going to go back to his statement about the countries or about the regions that have presented suitable economic stimuli proposals based on the building of infrastructure. And actually, you've made it easy for me to tackle this aspect. Well, indeed, there are many models, there are many recovery framework models, and my answer needs to be short. I would bring up two examples. One is the Australian model. From my standpoint, it is being a very pragmatic model. They have put both the federal government and the states have put forward 100 million to be invested in the form of equity, for instance, and they focus on two large sections: energy and conventional infrastructures. And talking about conventional infrastructures, they focus more on changing their transportation model. They really want to reinforce the railway model, also the use of wastewater and waste too. They're focusing on circular economies. Those are the main pillars for them. Another very relevant model is that of the European Union. It is perhaps a more mid-long-term type of model. The funds that they have put at the disposal of countries is 750 billion, and they have made clear that the core goal is the Green New Deal, and infrastructures will play an essential role in that context. They also want to develop renewable energy infrastructures, also for transportation, for sustainable building and recycling and circular economies. And the intention of the European Union is twofold. First, to stimulate the economy in the short term, ensuring or guaranteeing job positions and attenuating the impact of the pandemics. And also they have the objective of becoming a global leader in the transition process towards a sustainable and decarbonized economy, and that would bring about many advantages at the global level. Thank you very much, Luis. Philip was also talking about the fact that this is a good moment to accelerate the expertise existing in Latin America in something as important as mobility, for instance. So how can mobility contribute to the environmental transition in the region?
Well, frankly, it's not only Latin America, it's a world necessity. Transport is very late in respect to energy to make this transition. And we have to accelerate because we cannot avoid it. So I think in Latin America, the issue is really, as Luis said, very much the model of the project. It's not very much an issue of financing. Financing is there, but very often there are models that prevent the participation of the private sector. And as Antonio said, it's absolutely necessary to have this partnership between public and private. But as far as mobility is concerned, except for freight rail, which is a little bit specific, but if you think about urban transport and rail transport, where the necessities are very big in Latin America, you will not be able to get any project to fly without the participation without public money, either from at the union level, at the state level, at the municipality level. And that's where comes the difficulties in Latin America, because these entities have difficulty for planification and of availability of money. That's once again where the development bank are essential. And as Luis said, when he was speaking about some kind of flexibility, I suppose what he meant is really to be able for the private sector to propose our ways of doing business that are successful elsewhere. And once again, we know quite well what are these models that are successful. And to be able to provide the technology, as I said earlier. On this aspect, it's important that in the tender are not decided only based upon the price. If the price is in only criteria, you will not have not as good quality and not as good technology as if you have a combined criteria between price and other aspects. That's where, once again, also, the intervention of the development bank is important, because at the same time, you have to be careful that the transparency of the process is fully respected. And as far as international companies, as our company, this is absolutely essential. We cannot participate in any process that doesn't guarantee this kind of transparency. So I think you have a cocktail of possibilities of solutions that are on the table. And I see all the elements if all the stakeholders agree on this menu, that there can be a recovery of transport projects. And frankly speaking, as far as our company is concerned, we are ready to participate. We have never left Latin America, whatever the difficulties were in the past, I would say 50 years. So this crisis is more difficult probably, but it's a world crisis, and we are here to help.
Sí, muchas gracias. Vamos un poquito.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so I'm going to ask you to be brief in this last question round. For the CAF Vice President for Infrastructures, I will go back to the first question that had already been answered by other panelists. I would really like it if you could delve deeper into what the financing should be like in the context of that public and private effort that needs to be made to tackle the issue of infrastructures. In the short term, we need to take steps fiscally so that we can have investment to solve these problems quickly, and we need to have multilateral support by the CAF. The CAF is developing suitable lines to have quick disbursement for projects, and also we need to have other lines for public companies. And for the mid and long term, we need to have very good environmental partners for these projects too. And in order to do this, we need to have quality appraisal. Planning investments is essential here, even to attract international foreign investors, and for this purpose the CAF is also developing specific products. Actually, President Carranza is having conversations with the European Union and other countries or regions to try and promote a way to guarantee investments in our region following very sound standards. We want to mobilize internal resources, multilateral resources, external support, and private resources with the necessary guarantees that are tailor-made to the different projects. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antonio. Ambassador, Panama has recently passed a law promoting public-private partnership for the development of infrastructure projects. Can you please elaborate on this law and on the projects that you have in the investment portfolio? Yes, thank you very much, Narciso. Indeed, for us, the legal certainty for investments is an essential topic. In Panama, for this purpose, we have more than 20 free trade agreements that cover commercial partners in 60 countries, and we have access to 1.3 billion consumers in those 60 countries around the globe. So with all those, we can create special conditions for trade and investment. As in all treaties, there is a chapter that focuses on investments. This provides legal certainty and guarantees for foreign investment in our countries. And last year, in the second half of the year, as part of the administration of Cortizo's administration, we approved a law to promote public-private partnerships as an example of the specific actions that we are implementing to guarantee legal certainty, specific large-scale projects that the government wants to undertake with the support of private investment. Projects that will amount to more than $50 million are tackled by this public-private partnership law, especially for infrastructure, energy, logistics, and telecommunications industries. And currently in our portfolio, we have 4 projects that focus on highway maintenance and energy transmission that could be ready to be released into the market soon. And we are also working on putting together more projects to include them in the portfolio. And these projects will be developed so that investors can get to know the conditions in advance and the requirements, the incentives, and their return on investment that they could expect on the development of these projects. As an agency, this law is a great step forward because for the first time ever we can be proactive and look for specific projects that the country needs, not just promoting the general advantages that Panama offers as an ideal place for investment, because here we're talking about very specific investments, and we are working with the Public Works Ministry and other institutions of the state to further develop the investment portfolio. We have created a specific office to handle these issues, and if someone is interested in having access to further information on this law and on projects included in the portfolio, we are at your disposal to send it over to you. Thank you very much. Luis, a very specific question for you. What steps need to be taken by public administrations to foster the participation of the private sector in the infrastructure stimulus development plan? Well, this is a clear problem that was already existent before COVID. In terms of investment, there is a gap that some have appraised up to 3 trillion, and we are not bridging that gap. The breach between the rift between investment and need needs to be bridged, and clearly the budgets of public administrations and governments don't have sufficient funds to bridge the gap. Therefore, the participation of the private sector is essential. My recommendation would be for governments to consider what I said in the first question. When they need a quick impact, perhaps they need to go towards alliance type of contracts, collaborative models, flexible models, SECI models, where the private sector also participates in the definition phase and implementation phase, and the advancement is way more efficient. There's many examples of this kind across the globe. When we're talking about other types of contracts, I think PPT contracts will be the solution going forward. And here I have a very clear recommendation, which is to share the risks between the private and public sectors. We need to have a more balanced risk allocation so that we can really allocate those risks in a more balanced fashion. And this event has been organized by CAF, and I think a recommendation that needs to be raised, and that we have as industrial developer companies, because we focus on developing and building those infrastructures. What we recommend is for financial institutions to offer more flexible products, to provide equity, senior debt, subordinated debt, and guarantees that will allow for financing in the local currency, which is essential in Latin America, and thus guaranteeing sustainability similar to the project that they have in the European Union, because this guarantees the implementation of those projects. Thank you very much, Luis. Philip, also a very specific question for you. Conditions that must happen so that infrastructure projects can be implemented in Latin America. What are the priority conditions?
Lo que yo diría muy rápidamente es unas buenas tres condiciones. Por un lado, un marco legal basado en estándares internacionales, no implicar estándares latinos, porque la única consecuencia sería retrasar este tipo de proyectos. El segundo, y tal vez sea el más difícil en Latinoamérica, continuidad en las bonificaciones. Ya sé que es muy difícil porque existe un ciclo de elecciones políticas en la mayor parte de los proyectos, y la mayoría parte de los planes que hay en el sector se ven afectados por estos ciclos políticos, pero es esencial en nuestro negocio. Y tercero, como había dicho, promover las tecnologías verdes y dar una ventaja a estas tecnologías verdes, las tecnologías verdes que se implementan en Latinoamérica y que utilizan los recursos de Latinoamérica. Deberíamos de nuevo escuchar la voz de Latinoamérica en cuanto a la sostenibilidad, y desafortunadamente en los últimos años hemos estado muy cerrados, especialmente en las negociaciones contra el cambio climático, y hemos olvidado la voz de Latinoamérica.
Muchísimas gracias, Philippe. Y yo les voy a pedir que trabajen
Thank you
un
very
poquito
much,
más.
Philippe, and I'm going to ask
Me
you to
gustaría
work a
a
little
cada
bit
uno de
more. I would
ustedes,
like
cada uno
to
de
ask
vosotros,
each one of
dos
you
cosas. Un
two
pequeño
things.
tweet que nos ayude.
On one hand, can you tweet so that the teams that are working in this seminar, in this forum, or in this conference can very fast show the social media what we're doing and a message thinking about the future. And we're starting with Antonio Silveira. A lot of planning with the support of CAF for the recovery and for the sustainable growth. Thank you. Carmen. I will say that infrastructures can be the driver for economy before, during, and after the pandemic, and especially the type of productive infrastructures that are going to be needed need to be carefully analyzed, because we know that resources and availability of resources is going to be much more complicated than in the process of recovery of the countries. But I think it's one of the sectors in which is worth investing. This is not an expenditure. This is an investment. Whatever you do in infrastructure is an investment, because you will be able to reap benefits from it in the future. And not only physical infrastructures, but also digital infrastructures, and especially the part of connectivity that it is now very relevant for the new way of doing business after the pandemics. Luis, one tweet, one message for the future. One very important part that will take us out of this crisis is in the planning and in the development of sustainable infrastructures. How about Philippe, your turn?
Latin America are on the same boat, and climate change is the first priority.
El mío, si lo permiten, muchísimas gracias. Philippe vuelve a hablar de.
Mine, if you don't mind me saying so, is, well, Philippe has spoken about a more united region, a more structured region, a committed region. Our motto, more Latin America. Well, we have heard wonderful lessons on this topic, and before closing this panel, I would like to give you several examples about how large is the concept of infrastructure, not only limited to the digital and to the physical ones. I would like to highlight two other infrastructure concepts, as we call them. Human infrastructure, mentioned by the Vice President of Kav at the beginning of his presentation, that one that it is oriented towards people, towards our citizens, and more especially towards the young people in Latin America. They are the future of Latin America, and they are the best trained generation we've ever had. And this has to do with training, reskilling, and especially talent retention for these topics that we're tackling today. And the other infrastructure that have not been mentioned, but it's essential because it's the main infrastructure in a country, and I know that you're going to notice that I'm a good representative of an entrepreneurial association, is social dialogue. I'm sure that those are topics that are very interesting for a future debate, and hopefully CAF will have us on board. I would like to express my appreciation to CAF, his executive vice president, and all the teams and experts that have been kind enough as to share their knowledge, their expertise with all of us. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon.
Muchas gracias a Narciso Casado por haber moderado este segundo panel y también.
Thank you very much, Francisco Casado, for the moderation of this new panel. Also our speakers, Carmen Gisela Vergara, Luis Castilla, Philippe Deleur, and Mr. Castillo. We have spoken about the relevance of planning and development of infrastructures that are sustainable, and its relevance as a driver for growth, not only of physical infrastructures, but also the digital ones. Narciso Casado said it, digitalization is not an option. Also, the recommendations that we've heard, for example, by Luis Castilla, that recommended us not to stop the activities that have to do with infrastructures. We we've also heard how they highlighted the relevance of public-private partnerships and also the need for making the models a bit more flexible. And talking about models, we've seen how one of the best models to follow is the Australian one, or also the model of the EU, because of the large reactivation or stimulus packages that they are applying. And precisely for this, Philippe Deleur was very optimistic, referencing the relevance of this type of packages that can make us feel a bit more positive about the future, because they're actually investing historical amounts of money, unprecedented amounts of money. So once we have finished with this second panel, we're going to move into the final part of this conference. Remember that if you haven't done so yet, you can share your thoughts through the social media. You can do it so using the hashtag that we've mentioned throughout the event, Europe CAF, or you can do so with our account Agenda CAF in Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So we're going to move on to the conclusions of this event. We've heard some partial conclusions of the first panel, and we're going to move to the one of the second one. And for doing that, we're going to hear Antonio Garamendi, who is the president of the Spanish Confederation of Entrepreneurial Organizations.
Sí, muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. From Spain, good morning to everyone in Latin America, dear President of CAF, Luis, the General Secretariat from Iberoamerica, the European Commissaire of International Relations, the ministers from Ecuador and Uruguay, the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, dear friends, dear attendees, dear participants in this event. I believe this is a very, very important event. And the first thing that I have to do is to thank CAF for this series of events that they've done year after year. And we believe that we have to congratulate on behalf of all the Spanish organizations for their initiative. And of course, we are here to help them and also to express my appreciation to Casa de America, because they've given us the possibility of getting together and seeing ourselves in this time. We're getting accustomed to see ourselves through these digital ways. We would have loved to see ourselves face to face, but unfortunately, we have to use these digital tools, and we have to do these remote working tools that are here to stay, as we normally say here. I would like to highlight several aspects related with the reality. First of all, what we're living. We're living an economic crisis as a consequence of a health crisis that has radically changed things. This is not a financial crisis that produces an economic crisis. No, not at all. But here, Spanish organizations have always followed the healthcare recommendations. And we'll see how we face the end of this pandemic. We can't wait for it to be over. And in that sense, I'm sure that the same thing applies to Latin America, but I would like to concentrate more in the future. And this is what you were discussing on the previous panel. And it is at that point, in this second stage, where CAF is key when we talk about investing in infrastructures. And we're starting to hear about investing in infrastructures, but not only limited to the physical ones, nor to the digital ones, but on the contrary, we're also talking about investing in people's infrastructure or human infrastructures. The best infrastructure of a country is social peace, and this is coming through social dialogue. So that's very important to consider that at that infrastructure level that we were talking about. In Spain, we participate in this idea of more America, promoting America. We do so through CEIB, the Ibero-American Confederation of Entrepreneurs, the ILO, CLO is also together in this, and we work as a big family because that makes us stronger. This is very important. A few days ago, we also had meetings with Portugal, with the King, participation of the King of Spain and the President of Portugal, and my dear colleague Antonio, the President of the Entrepreneurial Organization of Portugal. I'm Vice President of the Confederation of European Entrepreneurs, and we are the bridge towards Europe, for Latin America towards Europe, and that's also very important. And this is one of the key aspects that I would like to highlight. We are based in freedom, which is key, and multilateralism. For us, this is absolutely fundamental. Freedom of market, freedom of working is absolutely essential, but also multilateralism. And we have to see things as a big opportunity. That's why we are entrepreneurs. For example, a lot of European funds are flowing to Spain, and I would like to talk about one concept. This afternoon, you're talking about digitalization. Digitalization, it's globalization. Digitalization is the future, and digitalization requires innovation. I think we're far from that level of innovation in Spain. We've realized that we have a challenge ahead of us. We would like to tackle this innovation channel, and in our Latin American community, it will be very important to manage this innovation. Together with digitalization and innovation is also been mentioned training. It's very difficult for us to reach our goals, to fulfill our goals, if we are not capable of train our people, starting for reskilling and retraining the entrepreneurs. And also, in other aspects, this will have an impact in job creation. In Spain, for example, we're working in dual training, ongoing training, lifelong training, especially tackling digital subjects, because it is now where we have the greatest deficit, training deficit. Also, it is very important to talk about sustainability. It's a challenge, but also a great opportunity. It's definitely not a problem, and can be tackled through energy, circular economy. Is going to be another fundamental milestone for the 21st century. Together with another reflection that it is fundamental because it will create many jobs and well-paid jobs, the industry. We have to start thinking about having a modern history that will become an engine or a driver of an economy, so that the rest of the economy and the service sector will follow. So we have to see all of these aspects as challenges, but also as opportunities and as positive opportunities. And for that, we need these private-public partnerships, and we have to be united as we are united today in this meeting. And this means that we have to be united, entrepreneurs and workers. We need to be together in the political class, and we have to be together amongst different countries, because this is a challenge not for any specific person, association, organization, or country. It's a challenge for all of us, and this is what we have to do it. And at COE, we have created an office to support managing this large amount of money that is going to flow to Spain to coordinate future infrastructure projects, entrepreneurial projects. And of course, in Latin America, CAF will play an essential role. And in this CAF role mainly concentrated on SMEs. SMEs are very important for the future of the economy, especially in the Latin American region, and we definitely need to foster SMEs in training and in everything. They are the ones that are going to lead the changes and to lead the revolution and will lead the growth. We have an entrepreneurial summit, and we've spoken with the people in Spain, and we know that we not only have to create infrastructure, but we have to create other values that can be key, that are going to be absolutely essential for things to work out. And the panel that spoke before me referred to these values as well. Allowed me to read 8 conclusions that I believe them to be very important. First of all, and this impacts all of us in the entrepreneurial sector, legal certainty has to be key to generate credibility and to attract investment. Without legal certainty, there's not going to be any private investment. I have to be as clear as that. We have to be aware of the things that we're talking about. Narciso Casado said it. Social dialogue and social consensus is essential to promote changes that will help us to recover from the crisis. Consensus and social dialogue is another essential element. A more flexible and adapted to changes regulatory framework will also be key to improve the economy. Things changes on a day-to-day, and we need to work with more flexibility. This was also said by the previous panel. PPPs are essential in the provision of public services in health and in education, as well as in infrastructures. This is fundamental, as you've said in this second panel. The preservation of the productive fabric in Spain, we're working in dialogue and in social agreement. And in Spain, we have public subsidies, public guarantees, and we need to adapt them and to the evolution of the economy, protecting jobs and creating jobs, formal jobs, and at the same time the hibernation of companies so that they can recover their jobs the moment they can go back to full work. Reindustrialization to generate better paid jobs and quality jobs. The digitalization of the productive fabric, mainly of the SMEs, and above all of the public administration. This is one of the greatest deficits that we have. And there is one more thing that is absolutely key: equal opportunities. Equal opportunities can be achieved through training and inclusive growth through training and education, because in this sense, and we say this here loud and clear, people and jobs are our priority, because this is the best possible way of achieving social inclusion, and we must not leave anyone behind in this. And that's what we're working on. That's what we're working on in entrepreneurial associations. That's what we're doing at business at Europe Union, and this is what we're doing. And I encourage you to go on like that. And I just want to finish by thanking again CAF for inviting me to participate with all of you in this meeting. And as a football manager will say, someone from the other side of the pond, the message has to be always positive. This match, we're going to win it. Be sure. And that same football manager says another thing, and he's totally sure, and we're sure of that as entrepreneurs, because we know the word effort. This match, we're going to win it, and we're concentrate on every match at a time. Thank you very much. These type of initiatives can be fundamental to put in common all of our ideas And there's something that's very important to express our special appreciation to CAF and the work that they do on behalf of the corporations, especially the ones in Latin America. Thank you. Thank you very much, Antonio Garamendi, who is the president of CEOE. And to finish the session of today, we're going to give the floor to Antonio García Belaunde, representative of CAF in Europe, who will share some final reflections. First of all, I would like to thank CEOE and Casa de America for having co-sponsored this event, which is not the first one, but is one of the dialogues that we have here as CAF with the institutional representatives of EU institutions and representatives of Entrepreneurial Association in Europe. This event, done according to the social distancing measures of the pandemic, has concentrated on the issue of how to create effective alliances for economic recovery. If this pandemic has meant something, if COVID has meant something, it's meant that we've all suffered the impact of it. In Latin America, we suspect that our GDP is going to drop by at least 9%, and some social indicators such as poverty levels or the levels of extreme poverty will drop to levels that we had 10, 15 years ago, and that's a tragedy. That's an actual tragedy. We have enjoyed very important years of growth, and we have been able to advance in our fight against extreme poverty and exclusion, and those earnings of these last years can be lost in an instant, and we will have to start all over again, like Sisyphus Smith carrying a stone all the way up the hill. But we are clearly aware of the things that we can do, and the policies that have been announced and implemented by several countries here in Europe and in Latin America are not so different from one another, in the sense that we have gotten rid of certain rigid orthodoxies to be able to attend this crisis. And in that sense, we have to mention the meaning of the word integration and inclusion nowadays, because CAF is still an integration element. And we should, for an economic recovery, get in depth in the development of infrastructures that foster integration. And that means not seeing infrastructures from a traditional perspective, but also infrastructures that have to do with more modern things, such as developing digital infrastructures, and that's what we're doing. We are working on different multiple projects that require a level of investment that makes things very difficult at this point, but that we have to tackle little by little, and getting the EU support. And I'm not talking about the technical cooperation or technical assistance that we got in the past, but it means that carrying out together jointly the development in Latin America of an infrastructure that can be useful to achieve the well-being of the people, that will create jobs, will create well-being and wealth. And that's a task that is more urgent than ever, and hopefully Europe can be our partner in it. In fact, we have a large number of Spanish and European companies participating in our activities, but we still have many challenges ahead of us, mainly because if the pandemic is showing us something, is that the chapters that they have given us are new and others that we already knew, and they cannot be tackled individually by the countries or separately by the countries. They require the cooperation and the collaboration of all the countries, and they need to be faced jointly, otherwise we won't be able to solve them. And this exercise that we do year after year is an exercise to find with Europe those areas in which it's possible to work jointly. So my appreciation to all the participants. We've had a very fruitful evening today. Thank you very much for them because they've participated in these special circumstances because of the social distancing measures. Thank you very much for the generous contribution to rethink in light of the last and dramatic events brought to us by the pandemic. Thank you for helping us to rethink how to work jointly so that this meeting between Latin America and Europe, so that this special and multiple link that unites these two continents can give us a good response capacity in the face of these new challenges. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice evening. Thank you very much, José Antonio García Belaunte, representative of CAF in Euro. And personally, on behalf of CAF, Development Bank from Latin America, I would like to express my appreciation to all the guests that were with us in this broadcasting. Also, thanks to our video partner, El País, and also the Casa de America for their wonderful cooperation, and also to the Entrepreneurial Association of Spain. And thank you to all the participants following this event from their computers, their smartphones, or any other device. Thank you very much for being with us in this event, and have a nice evening.